Well, hello, everybody. How's everybody doing out there? Hi, can you hear me back there in the bleacher seats, yeah? What an amazing 24 hours over here. The speakers, the quality of the speakers, and the beautiful venue, and you students, and the quality of the questions. I am just so impressed. Mark Tooley is the guy who makes this happen, he and his team. Let's have a round of applause for Mark Tooley, if we could. I am so impressed. And now that I've praised him, I've known Mark for many years, now I'm going to publicly denounce him. Because of the calendar, the schedule of speakers, one after another. You can't even get a cookie or a cup of coffee or go to the bathroom. Just give us a break next time. I told him I was going to publicly denounce him. So how about an amen on that? Oh, that's right. I warned him. I begged him. He didn't listen to me. All right. We've heard from political scientists. We've heard from philosophers, moral theologians. I am none of those things. I'm an historian, and I'm not really capable of very much abstract thought. You got to land the plane with Loconte pretty quickly. I am the great-grandson of a baker, the grandson of a barber, and the son of an eggman from Brooklyn. We don't do philosophy in the Loconte family. That's the good news. And there's no bad news. All right, J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and war. Well, just over a century ago, maybe we can close those doors there. That help? Could we close those? Some of that background chatter, is that possible? Just over a century ago, the National Peace Council of Great Britain, this is a group of religious and secular peace organizations, over a century ago, they issued this proclamation: peace, the babe of the 19th century, is the strong youth of the 20th century. For war, the product of anarchy and fear, they say, let that phrase hang in the air, war, the product of anarchy and fear, is passing away under the growing and persistent pressure of world organization, economic necessity, human intercourse, and that change of spirit, that social sense, the zeitgeist of the age. The National Peace Council made that prediction in the 1914 edition of its Peace Yearbook. Within a matter of weeks, the nations of the earth became embroiled in a global conflict, the First World War, the most destructive and dehumanizing war the world had ever seen. So much for liberal delusions about human nature and the nature of human conflict. Two of the most beloved Christian authors of the last century, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, they were both thrust into the jaws of the industrial slaughterhouse of the First World War. Both served as second lieutenants with the British Expeditionary Force in France. And remember what the soldiers on the Western Front had to endure: the mortars, the machine guns, the tanks, the poison gas, the flamethrowers, the barbed wire, the trenches, and the mud. Never before had technology and science so conspired to destroy both man and nature. When it was all over, wrote Winston Churchill, torture and cannibalism were the only expedients that the civilized, scientific Christian states had been able to deny themselves. Well, C.S. Lewis was injured, nearly killed by a mortar shell which obliterated his sergeant who was standing nearby. Most of his friends perished in the war. He wrote his father from his hospital bed, "I could sit down and cry over the whole business." Tolkien fought at the Battle of the Somme, one of the fiercest concentrations of killing in the history of human combat. Some of you will know this. At the Battle of Somme, the Brits lost over 19,000 men on the opening day of the battle. It's still the bloodiest battle in British military history, and that's a lot of military history, right? Listen to Tolkien. "One has indeed personally to come under the shadow of war to feel its full oppression. To be caught up in youth by 1914, he says, was no less hideous an experience than to be involved in 1939 and the following years. By 1918, Tolkien says, all but one of my close friends were dead." So these men had no romantic illusions about the horror and the human cost of war. As C.S. Lewis put it, we remember the trenches too well. It was not only the experience of the trenches that gave them a sober view of war. 20 years after the end of the First World War, Tolkien and Lewis have to endure a Second World War. And they face the onset of that conflict, Great Britain near the center of it, with a sense of revulsion, of foreboding, of dread. Remember, what separates the British people from the barbarism of Europe in 1939? It's the English Channel and Winston Churchill. That's another talk for another day. Well, Lewis wrote to his friend, Don Griffiths, October 1938. Lewis to his friend, I was terrified to find how terrified I was by the crisis. Pray for me for courage. He wrote that on October 5th, 1938. What crisis is he talking about, friends? What crisis? 1938, October. Munich. The Munich crisis. When Hitler persuades the Democratic Allies to allow him to absorb a portion of Czechoslovakia for the false promise of peace. That's the crisis he's talking about. Tolkien is in a similar situation here. Let me think about it this way. For both of them, Tolkien and Lewis, their personal, professional lives are bracketed by the most devastating wars in human history, when Western civilization itself seems to sit on the edge of a knife. And yet, for these two extraordinary authors and friends, and we'll talk about that, their friendship, the experience of war, it deepened their spiritual quest, and it shaped their literary imagination. Out of war came a great friendship, and out of their friendship came their great imaginative works, stories about the conflict between good and evil, about heroism, about sacrifice for a noble cause. Put it down in 3 words: war, friendship, and imagination. War, friendship, and imagination. Tolkien creates The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Lewis earns fame for the Chronicles of Narnia and the Space Trilogy. These epic tales involve the struggles and sorrows and the triumphs of war. So what was their approach to war? Well, many veterans of World War I, as you guys know, has been referred to, I think, here a bit. Many World War I veterans, they wrote blistering anti-war novels and poetry in the 1920s. An entire generation of Christian ministers vowed never to support Britain in another war after the First World War. The students at the Oxford Union Society voted in 1933, quote, "This House will under no circumstances fight for its king and country," close quote. Tolkien repeatedly decried the utter stupid waste of war, as he put it in a letter. But he acknowledged also, quote, "It will be necessary to face it in an evil world," close quote. Lewis, writing in 1944, "We know from the experience of the last 20 years," think about that, writing in 44, the last 20 years, "we know from the experience of the last 20 years that a terrified and angry pacifism is one of the roads that leads to war." Both men fought honorably in World War I. They were part of the Home Guard during the Second World War, in addition to their life experiences. So what shaped their approach to war? Well, let me add this. Both men were educated in the literary canon of Western civilization: Homer, Virgil, Dante, Milton. Lewis said that outside of the Bible, Virgil's Aeneid had the greatest impact on his professional career. Think about that. The Aeneid, Lewis said, had the greatest impact on his professional career. The Aeneid has been described by one scholar as the single most influential literary work of European civilization for the better part of 2 millennia. It's a war story, friends. It's a war story. A story about origins, the founding myth of ancient Rome, written by Rome's greatest poet when his nation was in the throes of an identity crisis. The mission of Aeneas is not only to wage war and defeat the defiant tribes, his supreme mission is to establish a new civilization. From the Aeneid, "Roman, remember by your strength to rule earth's peoples, for your arts are to be these: to pacify, to impose the rule of law, to spare the conquered, to battle down the proud." The classical scholar A.T. Reyes says this about C.S. Lewis and his lifelong attachment to the Aeneid. A.T. Reyes: "For Lewis, a veteran of the First World War, the beauty and fascination of Virgil's poem lay in its expression of waste and loss. What affected him most was Virgil's need to depict the human tragedy within war." It wasn't only the sense of loss, though, I think, that moved Lewis. He wrote a letter to his friend, Dorothy Sayers, dated December 29th, 1946. Here's what he said. "I've just reread the Aeneid again." He read it. He didn't know how many times he'd read it and reread it. "I've just reread it again. The effect is one of the immense costliness of a vocation, combined with a complete conviction that it's worth it." Tolkien expressed the same kind of appreciation for Beowulf. Beowulf, considered the greatest surviving Old English poem, and again, one of the most important works of Western literature. The story of the Scandinavian warrior battling the forces of evil. Beowulf captured Tolkien's imagination when he was just a young man. He studied it, he translated it, he lectured on it for decades. One of the likely sources of Tolkien's dragon in The Hobbit, the desolation of Smaug, it's from Beowulf, which also features, of course, a dragon and stolen treasure. In that story, Beowulf defeats the demon Grendel, Grendel's mother, and a fearsome dragon, but at the cost of his own life. Tolkien was fascinated by these tales with their portrayal of the persistence of wickedness, the danger of pride, and the value of heroic sacrifice for a noble cause. Tolkien was asked to give a lecture, I think it was by the Natural History Museum of Oxford. Christmas lectures, I think it was 1938, 39. And the topic, his book, The Hobbit, had just come out, so he's pretty popular now with the kids. It's a Christmas program for kids. He's asked to deliver a lecture on dragons. And I only found this lecture, this talk he gave, because I went to the Bodleian Library. You can see the original manuscript. It's really hard to find it anywhere in any kind of published sources. Here's a piece of what he told these kids about dragons. For the dragon bears witness to the power and danger and malice that men find in the world. And he bears witness also to the wit and the courage and finally to the luck or grace that men have shown in their adventures. Not all men, and only a few men greatly. And then he went on. He said, dragons are the final test of heroes. Dragons are the final test of heroes. So, on the one hand, Tolkien and Lewis, they're not warmongers. They're not tempted to jingoism or militant nationalism. On the other hand, unlike many of their peers in the 1920s and 30s, they rejected pacifism. They rejected. They navigated between these two extremes, between militarism and pacifism. In their approach to the world, they embrace what we call Christian realism, I think. Reinhold Niebuhr, you've heard his name. Here's a line from Niebuhr. When the mind is not confused by utopian delusions, it is not difficult to recognize genuine achievements of justice and to feel under obligation to defend them against the threats of tyranny and the negation of justice. Well, Tolkien and Lewis carried no illusions about war because they had no illusions about the problem of evil. The problem of evil, the tragedy of the human condition. Remember in Lord of the Rings, the words of Elrond, of the Council of Elrond? And the elves deemed that evil was ended forever, and it was not so. You see this in Tolkien's children's story. In his children's story, The Hobbit. Remember the goblins in the story, the goblins? Listen to how Tolkien describes them. Now, goblins are cruel, wicked, bad-hearted. They make no beautiful things, but they make many clever ones: hammers, axes, swords, daggers, pickaxes, tongs, and also instruments of torture. They make them very well. It is not unlikely, he says, that they invented some of the machines that have since troubled the world, especially the ingenious devices for killing large numbers of people at once, for wheels and engines and explosions always delighted them. Now, what does that sound like? What does that sound like? Sounds like Mark Tooley putting around his backyard over there, doesn't it? No, not at all. It sounds like the industrialized slaughter of the First World War, the abuse of science and technology. What do we make of the ring in The Lord of the Rings? The battle between Mordor and Middle-earth is called the War of the Ring, my precious. Why go to war over a ring? Well, the ring gives you the ability to make yourself invisible, and whoever possesses the one ring controls all the others. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. In the 1950s, at the start of the Cold War, many people assumed that the ring was a symbol of atomic power, right? The nuclear age now. Tolkien sets them straight. But of course, my story is not an allegory of atomic power, he says, but of power exerted for domination. He just tells us what it's about. Power exerted for domination. He had a ringside seat to that in Britain throughout the 1920s and 30s. Well, the ring, as the embodiment of the will to power, the desire to exploit, dominate, to control the lives of others. The National Peace Council in 1914 claimed that war was, quote, the product of anarchy and fear, unquote. Today's progressive elites, well, they talk as if war could be eliminated through arms control agreements, international treaties, the spread of democracy, global redistribution of wealth, or maybe the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. It won't do, friends. Modern liberalism will not face honestly the problem of the will to power. Lewis tackles this theme in his essay, Why I Am Not a Pacifist. And I commend it to everybody in this room. It's a beautiful essay. Empathetic, sympathetic, but also very realistic. Why I'm Not a Pacifist. He challenges the claim that wars never do any good. Let me read you a few lines. How are we to decide whether the total effect would have been better or worse if Europe had submitted to Germany in 1914, he asks. It's of course true that wars never do half the good which the leaders of the belligerents say they're going to do. That may be a sound argument for not pitching one's propaganda too high, but it's no argument against war, he says. Then he goes on. It is certain that a whole nation cannot be prevented from taking what it wants except by war. It is almost equally certain that the absorption of certain societies by certain other societies is a greater evil. The doctrine that war is always a great evil seems to imply a materialist ethic, he writes, a belief that death and pain are the greatest evils, but I do not think that they are, he says. Well, for Tolkien and Lewis, war, it was a tragic necessity. This is a major theme in their works, right? But why? What's the purpose of war? What good could it achieve? From the Lord of the Rings, Faramir, the captain of Gondor. War must be while we defend our lives against a destroyer who would devour all. But I do not love the bright sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for his glory. I love only that which they defend. The innocent, right? The innocent. War as a moral necessity to protect the innocent from great harm, to preserve human freedom, to defend civilization against barbarism. This is the moral core of the Christian just war tradition, from Augustine to Aquinas, Grotius, and beyond. Tolkien and Lewis wrote epic fantasy, right? They revived the medieval concept of the heroic quest. Tolkien said that when he read a medieval work, it stirred him to produce a modern work in the same tradition. And that's part of his great achievement, isn't it? Recall what Lewis does in the Chronicles of Narnia. Narnia is a realm of kings and queens where a code of honor holds sway, where knighthood is won or lost on the field of battle. Well, isn't this just medieval nostalgia? Isn't this just a form of escapism? Because they're accused of that. Well, maybe it's just the opposite. Maybe the theme of war, of a struggle between light and darkness, maybe that's essential in an age of moral cynicism. Courage, valor, can I use the word chivalry, in wartime for a just cause. Both authors believed that this was the only realistic path in a dangerous world. Listen to C.S. Lewis on this. It offers the only possible escape from a world divided between wolves who do not understand, and sheep who cannot defend the things which make life desirable. Defending the things that make life desirable, that make it worth living. Freedom, beauty, love, faith. In The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien presents us with two kinds of heroes in wartime. We've got the extraordinary man, right? The hidden king, determined to fight for his people against the great evil. And then we've got the ordinary man, ordinary woman, the hobbit. Got any hobbits out there in the audience? Closet hobbits? Want to raise your hand? Confess right now. The hobbit, the person like us who is, quote, not made for perilous quests, as he says. Where did Tolkien get his idea for the hobbit? We'll go back to the First World War, to the Western Front, where Tolkien served as a second lieutenant, struggling with his men to stay alive. I've always been impressed that we are here, surviving, he says, because of the indomitable courage of quite small people against impossible odds. The hobbits were made small, he explained, to show up in creatures of very small physical power the amazing and unexpected heroism of ordinary men at a pinch, he says. He's talking about the men, yes, the men that he fought alongside in the trenches in France, the British Expeditionary Force. They were not, for the most part, a professional army. They were citizen soldiers, shopkeepers, bartenders, clerks, farmers, fishermen, and gardeners. Listen to Tolkien. My Sam Gamgee is indeed a reflection of the English soldier, of the privates that I knew in the 1914 war and recognized as so far superior to myself. So think about it. One of the most beloved characters in modern fiction is based on the ordinary English soldier at his post, ready to fight and die for his country, for his band of brothers. Well, for these two giants of literature, whose lives were so profoundly affected by war, there's only one truth, one singular event that can end the long war against evil, undo the tragedy of the human condition, and bring lasting peace. Only one thing. It's the return of the king. In Narnia, of course, the king is Aslan, the great lion, the Christ figure. Only Aslan knows the way to that blessed realm that lies beyond the sea. The light ahead was growing stronger, writes Lewis in the last battle. Lucy saw that a great series of many-colored cliffs led up in front of them like a giant staircase. And then she forgot everything else because Aslan himself was coming, leaping down from cliff to cliff like a living cataract of power and beauty. This king comes in power and beauty as the voice of conscience and as the source of consolation, as the lion and the lamb. In Tolkien's story, the king is Aragorn, right? Aragorn, the chief epic hero of the Lord of the Rings. Heir to the kingship of Gondor, his life is devoted to the war against Sauron. His true stature is made known, however, only after Sauron's defeat, when he finally assumes his throne. Here's how Tolkien describes that moment. See if it brings anything to mind. When Aragorn arose, all that beheld him gazed in silence, for it seemed to them that he was revealed to them now for the first time. Tall as the sea kings of old, he stood above all that were near. Ancient of days he seemed, yet in the flower of manhood, and wisdom sat upon his brow, and strength and healing were in his hands, and a light was about him. And then Faramir cried, "Behold the king!" It's in these war stories, friends, war stories, tales of loss and recovery, of cowardice and courage, of betrayal and redemption, that we find a clue to the meaning of our earthly journey. Is everything sad going to come untrue? Asks Sam. For the creators of Narnia and Middle-earth, here is the deepest source of hope for the human story, the belief that God and goodness are the ultimate realities, and that the shadow of sin and suffering and death will finally be lifted from our lives. The great war will be won. This king, who brings strength and healing in his hands, will make everything sad come untrue. Thanks for listening. Time for questions.
I guess this is more of a comment, and maybe you can respond. So C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity was given in World War II in Britain's darkest hour. I was wondering, what effect do you think that had on the people to revive their spirit, give them hope, give them meaning for fighting a war?
That's a terrific question. What's your name? Corey. Thank you, Corey. It's a terrific question. Yes, C.S. Lewis, some of you may not know this, Mere Christianity came out of a series of radio broadcasts that the BBC asked him to deliver to defend the truths of the Christian faith. That's how far we have come, friends. In 1940, the BBC thought to do that. They thought that Great Britain needed, in addition to Winston Churchill, they needed a voice helping people to find faith, hope, and strength during the Blitz. This is during the Blitz. Remember, this is 57 nights of consecutive air raids against the city of London. Think about the 9/11 attacks. Think about that, 57 consecutive nights of ruin in London and then the other cities. That's what the Brits are going through. BBC asked Lewis to deliver a series of radio broadcasts. You know, I've read some of the letters, and not that easy to find sometimes, of people who were young and they heard Lewis on the air, and they're reflecting on that time and the strength that it gave them. It's one of the, if I can just make a plug here, it's one of the scenes we want to recreate in the film series that I'm doing, the documentary film series on Tolkien, Lewis, and War, to get into an English pub with Lewis's voice coming over the, over the radio. I think it did a tremendous amount because it made his voice, next to Winston Churchill, who's probably one of the most recognizable personalities in Great Britain for that period of time. That's the reach that the BBC had. And of course, the book went on to become this best-selling book and influenced so many people's lives afterwards. But in the moment, the British people are trying to make sense of this. How in the world could this catastrophe have happened again? Again. And I think that's the thing to stress for us, maybe as Americans. Remember the First World War? We came in last. As the Brits like to say, we came in late. We suffered the least. And we came out the strongest. We didn't have the same kind of sense of devastation. None of the war was fought on our soil. But the Brits are still reeling from that. And the idea they have to go through it again, it caused so many people to turn away from the faith. And I think Lewis had a profound effect on shoring up people's courage, but also leading them to faith as well. And many, many testimonies that are out there that need to be tracked down. It's a great dissertation topic to take on for somebody. Thanks for that question. Appreciate it. Yes, sir.
Oh, I just want to say thank you for the wonderful talk. You kind of talked about how, you just sort of offhand mentioned how Tolkien and C.S. Lewis were both kind of accused of being escapists. I believe Tolkien, I don't know how true this is, but I believe he kind of owned that. He described sort of his idea of escapism to being similar to, if you're a soldier trapped in a prison camp, don't you have a duty to try and escape? I don't know, maybe that plays to the sort of same concept of us as Christians, we're meant for the next life. I just want to know if you had anything to say to that kind of idea.
That's a terrific question. Tell me your name.
Greg.
Thank you, Greg. You're right about Tolkien. He owned it in the sense that he wanted to turn it on its head. Not escaping reality, but escaping from the illusions is really how Tolkien and Lewis both agreed. Escaping from the illusions that the modern world was feeding us, the lies that the modern world was feeding us. We can't overemphasize the culture of lies that we are now swimming in about ourselves, about the human condition, about politics, and all the rest of it. And he's saying, look, I'm going to use fantasy. I'm going to use the genre of fantasy, fiction, epic myth, to teach deep truths about the human condition. And that's what he does in The Lord of the Rings in a magnificent way. Lewis does in the Chronicles of Narnia. And so what do those works do? They reveal what? They reveal the depth of evil, the problem of evil, the persistence of power. Remember how Frodo, he's, of course, one of the heroes in the story, but when you get to the cracks of Mount Doom, spoiler alert here, friends, when you get to the cracks of Mount Doom, you know what Frodo does. I am not going to do now what I came to do. The ring is mine. And he puts it back on his finger. So the ring is destroyed, but it's not even destroyed by Frodo, is it? Or by the Fellowship. It's destroyed by Gollum. Gollum. This, as Tolkien put it, a sudden turn of grace, a sudden act of grace, right? A eucatastrophe was the phrase that Tolkien developed, the unraveling of a catastrophe. So the point is the persistence of evil. Even the heroes in their stories, there is such a susceptibility to temptation, to being overrun by it, overwhelmed by it. That's realism, isn't it? Right? That's realism. That's not escapist. When Lewis reviewed Tolkien's book, The Lord of the Rings, the first draft of it, the first volume, he said the feeling that he had was not escapism, because the charges were flying right out of the gate. He says, the feeling I have is dread. The feeling that I can't just remain in my little hobbit hole in front of the fire. There's a real world out there I have to engage in. I'll tell you just a personal quick story. I didn't start reading The Lord of the Rings until I was in my mid-40s. I was doing my academic work at King's College London. I'm a late bloomer, people. And as my friends like to say, Loconte, you call that blooming? Yeah, all right. But yes, late bloomer. So I'm reading it in my 40s. I'm doing my doctorate. I'm reading John Locke during the day, and I'm reading Lord of the Rings at night in a great English pub, which is a great way to do it. And I came away not escaping reality. I felt just fortified for the task at hand, for the world at hand. Morally invigorated is how I felt. Here's what deceit and cowardice looks like, but here's what courage and heroism look like. That's a pretty good thing to be thinking about, I think. Terrific question. I appreciate that. I hope I took a stab at it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, terrific. Yes, sir, come on up. And as you're coming up, let me just read a few lines, if I can find it quickly, which also fills out that point, if I can find it quickly. Let's see. If I can't find it, we'll just... Oh, here it is, yeah. This is Edmund Fuller, real quickly. Edmund Fuller, a book. He's a literary critic. He's writing like in 1960s, late 1960s. He's writing about Lewis and Tolkien and their works. And Edmund Fuller is a Christian literary critic, writing at the time, I think, for the New York Times. And he's disgusted with the direction that modern fiction has taken, becoming so cynical and degrading of the individual. And he's giving a defense of Tolkien and Lewis. And here's what he says. Let's see. It's not escapist, not in the pejorative sense. Indeed, it may offer temporary refuge and relief from the pressure of our immediate world. But if it is of depth now, he's talking about fantasy, epic myth and fantasy. If it is of depth, then we are brought to a deeper pondering and insight into central aspects of our actual lives. Our sensitivity is whetted to honor and courage and aspiration and beauty. No one thinking on these things is escaping reality. Couldn't say it any better. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for your talk, Dr. Loconte. My name is James Diddams, and I work at the Institute on Religion and Democracy. When you opened this talk, you were addressing the way that Tolkien and Lewis had grown up in a deep cultural well indebted to Virgil and Homer and John Milton and other various, greats of the Western canon. And later on, as you went, you mentioned, we were talking about Tolkien's, symbolism of the great grinding wheels of industry and things like that, that we took to be symbolic of like fascism. I thought you were going to say, and maybe this is something that other scholars would say, it was going to be a symbol of the creaking wheels of industry and technocracy crushing culture and beauty of Homer and Virgil and Milton, people who, studying those kinds of poems like Beowulf, there is no practical, or if I could say capitalistic purpose to those things. And I'm wondering, do you think that, thinking about what we've lost today, I increasingly have the sense that we're in a new dark age, that the kinds of deep cultural meanings that are built up over thousands of years, that cannot just be pulled out of the sky, we don't have those anymore. I bet very few people in this room have read, the greats of Virgil and Homer and Milton. Maybe some people, if you're an English major, you've read like one of those. If you're a classics major, you've read Virgil and Homer. Yeah. No one, thinking about the way that to get into Harvard 200 years ago, you had to speak Hebrew and Latin.
Yes.
You had to have this deep, deep breadth of knowledge of the Western tradition. And I don't even know, like at Wheaton College where I went, I don't even know how to explain to someone who is purely interested in liberal arts education, because they know it'll get them into a finance institution. I don't even know the language to use to tell them otherwise. And I worry that we as Christians, we only pay lip service to the liberal arts, to the great tradition. Yeah. What do you think?
You have reason to worry. I wouldn't quite use the word dark ages, but I hear you. I hear you on that. Think about it. Since the late 1960s, 1970s, the desire to eliminate, expunge the Western canon from the curriculum. It's almost complete. There are some holdouts. The King's College, where I taught for a decade, is a holdout over there. Other great schools are holdouts. But back in the late 60s and 70s, what were they chanting there at I think at University of not San Diego, USC maybe it was, hey, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ has got to go. That was the chant, and here we are now. So what happens? We've cut ourselves off from this great cultural inheritance, this classical Christian inheritance. And I think Lewis and Tolkien consciously wanted to draw on that inheritance to push back against this incredible darkness. I think in ways maybe there are wonderful biographies of both those men, and I've benefited from a number of them, but I'm not sure there's been enough attention given to how deliberate they were in drawing on that rich tradition to push back against the nihilism of their age. I mean, think about the ideologies that take flight after the First World War. Communism had been out there since the 19th century with Marx, but it takes off by 1919, 1920. They're having international world conferences because of the disillusionment with democratic capitalism. So you got communism. The fascists begin in my beloved Italy there in 1921, 22 with Mussolini, long before Hitler comes on the scene in a significant way, right? Communism, fascism, eugenics, materialism, scientism, those ideologies just really take off. And these guys have a ringside seat to it, and I think they're using, yes, the form of epic myth, epic literature, the mythic hero, but also they're drawing on those deep wells to push back the best they can in their world with their sense of vocation. They're not politicians, they're not philosophers, they're writers, right? They're writers, and they're doing everything they can to push back against the darkness. And look at the effect they had. Look at the effect. We're still talking about their books and making movies and TV series now. God help us, we'll see what ABC or Amazon does with it. But we're still talking about these men, and their books are still selling, and they've been translated into dozens of languages. So I don't know about Dark Ages. There are rational reasons to be hopeful, though. Rational reasons to be hopeful, because people do respond, I think, the way that we're wired by God, the way we're made. We respond to beauty. We respond to moral beauty, which is just embedded in their works. Does that help answer the question?
Thank you, Dr. Loconte. Yes.
Thank you for the question. Great question. Sorry it's a long-winded answer. Sorry about that.
Hey, thank you for coming out and talking to us today.
Sure.
My name is Rohan. I'm from Wheaton College. And I was wondering what kind of remedies would Lewis and Tolkien give to war, suffering, and the human condition?
Remedies, Rohan, remedies. Do you have one in mind, though? That's a huge question. I think I like the question, but could you unpack it just a little bit when you say remedy?
Well, I think we've talked a lot about the realities of growing up in war and suffering. But how do you say he resolves these conditions?
You know, there's such a profound sense to their works in that they both realize, if you think about Frodo coming back after the defeat of Sauron, the destruction of the ring, Frodo, he's not the same, right? Some biographers, they look at him and they think, is he kind of the shell-shocked veteran of the First World War? He's not himself. It's not quite right. Something's changed. The persistence of evil, the persistence of the shadow, right? And it's the same for Lewis. There's no final defeat on this side of the curtain. So there is no clear remedy for that, some perfect remedy for that. I think what they're going to say, though, if we just think about their works and how they live their lives, think about this for a minute. These men, they have the sense of calling. They are academics. They have to deliver lectures, do scholarship, produce scholarly articles, teach and mentor their students, grade student papers. Tolkien first wrote down the words, in a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. He wrote it while he was grading student examination papers, found a blank sheet, and said, oh my God, here it is. He didn't know why he wrote those words, he just wrote them, you know? He's just doing his work, his vocation. But they're both also chasing this other part of their calling, which is they're writers. And guess what? They're not getting paid to do that writing. They're writing their epic works in the evenings and on the weekends. They're not paid to do that. They're paid to do scholarship, teach students, give lectures. What does that tell us, friends? It tells us God has made us as richly complex people, and he's given us all a calling, not just a single calling, a broad calling to follow him, but then secondary callings in whatever politics, economics, the arts, whatever it is. And we're not always going to get paid to chase some of those callings. And I think that's part of the way we try to renew our society, our culture. Be faithful to the call as you're feeling it on your life. And that's going to mean some sacrifice. It's going to mean some sacrifice. These guys sacrificed to write what they wrote, but also to be together, which is the other thing I want to say before we're done here, Mark. We got just like another minute on that, I hope. 1 minute. I got 1 minute, okay. I will not publicly denounce you again until the next conference. They're in fellowship together. Let's not forget that. It's the Fellowship of the Ring. It's the Inklings who come together every Tuesday morning at the Eagle and Child Pub at Oxford, every Thursday or Friday in Lewis's rooms at Magdalen College. And friends, they met over a period of 20 years, every week through the war, to critique each other's work. Tolkien read out loud The Lord of the Rings, every chapter, to C.S. Lewis, either in the Inklings or over lunch or over a drink. Lewis heard every chapter read out loud. So they were writers in community. So whatever we're doing, our vocations, that's another key part of the answer. See, we got to do this in community, not on our own as we're chasing our callings. Seems to me that's one step toward a cultural renewal, the way we can inoculate ourselves from the lies that are coming at us all the time. Thank you for that question.
Thank you.
Thank you.